G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and importantly a fantastic weekend. Now, as always, we have a lot to go over, but I may take it a little bit slow, may have had 1 or 2 or 3 too many beers last night with a few old army mates that I hadn't seen in a while, but let's get stuck into it together. So we're going to talk a little bit about some foreign politics today. We need to look at, of course, India and China, not only incredibly important countries around the world now and incredibly important historically, but into the future, massive populations, massive developing economies will be incredibly important in the decades and centuries to come as well, and how the world will then be shaped. So we'll talk about that, relation to the global south, relation to Ukraine, relation to the EU specifically. Today we need to look at some attacks on an airfield. We'll look at what the Ukrainian ambassador in Turkey has said and some more messaging around the potential that we may see, to quote Zelensky, the end of the hot war that they're hoping for then at the end of this year, and frozen assets. But where I want to start, and I know many will be happy about this, you don't have to listen to me bang on for half an hour first, is we're going to start with the maps and look over some areas at some pieces that we have predicted a few months back here. So, and we're going to line that up then with the fortifications, the Ukrainian fortifications at the moment now. The Ukrainian fortifications are important now because Russia is on the offensive. If Ukraine goes on the offensive, then we'll be talking about the Russian fortifications. Anyway, let's have a look. So, of course, here is Ukraine in the center, the capital of Kyiv. The red areas have been occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Now, where I want to come is where Russia is having the most success is then down into the Avdiivka front. Now, something that I missed in the video yesterday, but I think I put on Telegram, was up in here that when then this area was surrounded and then fell, was that the guys actually withdrew not on command, but under then their own initiative too. What can, of course, raise a lot of concerns and questions about the command here. But where I want to speak about first is down in this area here that is quickly becoming then cut off for the Ukrainian forces in here. Now, I don't want to sound like some sort of knob jockey, but we did predict that this could be the situation now a few months ago, and now it is looking like this is then the developing situation. And we started with this, of course, when we spoke about the fall of Ulmansky and then Netilyovi. Now, if you want to watch what I said in a response video, this was then, I think, a bit over 2 months ago, but was about, is this a trap, and how then I specifically saw this then. So I'll link that down below, just to get an idea of what the concern in here could be. But the concern that I raised at the time was if Russia that continue the advancement in here was, they were cut off down here, which has taken place, so Ukraine can't come out of here. The way out of here is going to be very difficult. Look now where the grey zone, if we get rid of this so you can see it, is showing right up against then this reservoir that, depending on what forces are in here, the way out is going to be this. Now, this is very narrow. If we can do this to measure it, we're talking a couple of 100 meters across here. The withdrawal out of here could be very, very difficult. Like I spoke about yesterday, typically the force on offensive actions takes more casualties, needs more troops to launch offensives. That said, it's on the retreat when you can get absolutely decimated and lose then everything. And if you come out through here, firstly, you're going to be very close to where deep state has showed that Russia has had advancement today in Yasno-Borivka, so we're not sure if you can actually exit out of here. You're crossing a waterway either way, but even if you get out into this open area, you have a long way to go before there's somewhere like this that you can then cross out. So I think we may see at some stage a complete Ukrainian withdrawal back to where the Volcha runs through here, and give up that amount of land up to where we know then there is a defensive positions down the Volcha River, and Volcha River itself can work itself as a natural barrier too. But this movement right there, that is of concern as well, 100%. Now, We have then just a look up to the north here, and Russia today has made then significant gains. So if we go on the furthest part, although let's measure here, it's more fair. It's a 1.2 kilometre, and they've also closed up this gap in here by about 1.8 kilometres. Of course, this showing what Surak was talking about yesterday, if they're breaking into the first areas of Vesely, like we spoke about that. Now, Russia is closer to Pokrovsk than they now are to Avdiivka in the beginning of this year. That is an interesting point to note, as well as this close up in Prohez. So you can see that there has been a lot of ground made since, let's go the 23rd. This is over less than a week. There has been a significant amount of ground made in this front. Now, what I want to talk about, and we'll talk about down in here and up here at the same time, is where then the fortifications are then sitting in here. So this is now Avdiivka here. This is by Clement Molan. Follow his map, follow him on Twitter. And as you can see written in here somewhere, it says do not steal. I'm hoping that this is enough of a shout out to not be stealing this, but regardless, using it for reporting. So you can see where the Ukrainian line sits down in here, and it doesn't show any defensive works in here, although we know there will be to a degree some. Now, Clement Molan is the only really good source that I've found to show Ukrainian and Russian defensive works themselves. He's copped a hell of a lot of criticism for this. You can see some defensive works out in here. You can also see where some have fallen as well. But what I want to look on is more of a broad stroke. So you can see where Russia has made their ground out through Prohez in here towards Pokrovsk, but you can see where then the major defensive works are sitting around this intersection here where my cursor is, where we said this is an incredibly important area. Although from looking at this, some of these defensive works could be more expecting a east to west advancement rather than a northern advancement here. So how effective they are may be limited, but that is a very, very overhead observation. I can be completely incorrect on this also, but you can see beyond this, there is limited, very limited defensive works behind this. So yes, I know everyone loves to criticize if they're making, this amount of ground. If you make this amount of ground per week, it's going to take 25 years to get to Kiev. But I've spoken at length about attritional warfare. The doctrine of attritional warfare is, I think, in comparison to going into bankruptcy, little by little, and then sort of all at once can then start collapsing and you're broke, or making then a lot of ground. And if they get in behind these lines, you could potentially see very large then swaths of land. And you can see very similar as well between the Avdiivka Osheretny front and the Chasiv Yar Bakhmut front, and between New York and then Toretsky, that if you get in behind these areas too, you could have large swaths of land then starting to collapse. Now, is this every single trench line? No, of course not, but it gives us a broad outline of this. The defensive works that have fallen, and we know Ukraine fell out of Avdiivka to better positions around Berdachi, Semenivka, then better positions in Osheretny, better positions in Prohez, in these areas, and it has continually ground rearward. So eventually you may see large swaths. I just think this was an interesting piece to look at. Now, you can see these here, and then we do have, of course, then the Syriac map update here too. Now, Syriac, look, the amount of difference between these two maps, there's nothing massive. It does show more Russian advancement over this road to the north of Prohez on the deep state map, but the same level right in here, 100%. That has most likely happened between two maps. So we get that then. Reaching the first houses of Vesely, in addition, due to the complete withdrawal of the Ukrainian army from the eastern shore of the Volcha River in its axis, the rest of the locality of Volchem and the last part of Yevnivka was taken. Meanwhile, troops continue to advance towards then the next areas. Remember, the last two towns that are to the east of the Volcha River are this one down in here and Mezovi in here. I can't zoom in to see what this says. Shushny, I think it was. These are the last two in here. We may see, I think, a full pull up to here to better positions if they then exist. Now, we're going to talk about more map updates, but something I want to really talk about first is we have talked a lot about the changing messaging from Kyiv, from ambassadors, from the president, from everyone about this war, from there will be no negotiation with Russia. We won't talk with this. We won't do anything to. Now we're seeing a lot come out then about we want Russia at a peace deal. We want not Russia a peace deal. We want Russia at the next peace conference. They're looking to end, quote, the hot war this year. Zelensky believes that is then a reality. And today is no different. I'm making a folder of all this changing messaging that we've seen. And many people have reached out to me and said, yeah, they agree with my observation that if I'm seeing this changing message. And I asked you, are you seeing this too, or am I building it up in then my head? And are we seeing this preparation for the end of a war? Now, this is what then the Ukrainian ambassador to Turkey has then said today. We're working on establishing a humanitarian corridor with Turkey. So I believe this would go from the occupied territories through Russia, through Georgia, into Turkey, NATO. That's what I'm imagining, but I'm not sure. Ambassador Bodnar stated that Turkey has practically proven how much can be achieved with the will of the president and diplomatic efforts. The role played in Ukrainian and Russian negotiating teams in the Istanbul talks, grain agreement and prison exchange in the same year were the success of Turkish diplomacy. We know they've kept ties, at least channels open between both the West and with Russia too. He said that Turkey is an important part of the steps taken towards peace, and added that Turkey, which has gained experience in negotiations with Russia, can communicate with many countries, including the Global South. Not the first time we're going to talk about the Global South today, but this is the most important part. We're also creating a humanitarian corridor to bring back civilians and prisoners from occupied territories through Turkey. Now, many have pointed out that is this a level of bringing Ukrainian civilians who want to leave those areas out of those areas in preparation for maybe abandoning that land, surrendering that land if there is a peace deal and they don't get stuck on the wrong side of then a border? Is this preparations for this? Or is it removing civilians for a battle coming in the future? Now, I think more the first one of that with the messaging and stuff we're seeing, but this is interesting to see as well. And again, like I said at the end of the video yesterday, it's very, very few people in history have had the ability to share ideas and get critiqued by tens of thousands of people, and I'm incredibly blessed to have that. So I'd like to bounce that idea of you. What's your reading into this? That my reading is that it may be in preparation to get those people out so they're not stuck on then the wrong side of the new iron curtain that may be drawn across there. But let me know. Now, let's look at some then other areas on the map. Of course, we'll just come south of here, Krasnohorivka. Now, we have seen there has been maps updating through here, and we have seen that this map has been a few weeks behind maybe Syriac. Now we have got, of course, red on this map today. We also have a map from Syriac today. So let's then compare these two. Now, again, it isn't showing then as much, but look, apples and oranges to a degree. It's probably filled in across here, maybe one road to the north, but large scheme of things, within the center of Krasnohorivka, very, very similar to at least my eye. The most different spot here is on the northeastern side. So see this, I think this is either tree line or reservoir, just where my cursor is, that up to the north of here, right up to where this road runs, even out of the grey zone, by Syriac is saying is under Russian control, but we're not sure. There's also an investigation going into some of the management of the Ukrainian battalion that was in here. I might speak about that in a second video. I didn't look too deep into it. I just more saw then the headlines on Kiev independent of that today. Advancing towards the town of Krasnohorivka, close to 75% of it is under Russian control. Excuse me. Now, so a lot of control being exerted over Krasnohorivka. Now, let's then have a look up. And now while we're moving north, excuse me, we'll look around New York. Now, no changes shown on this map today, but we know this is an incredibly important location for both Ukraine and Russia. It's Ukraine's last line of 2014 ground in here, but we are getting images out that New York has just been completely destroyed as well. We know Fab 500s all the way to 3000s are being dropped in here. Street-to-street fighting, artillery battles then both ways. Incredibly difficult situation occurring in here. We also have photographs. If we look up into the north of Volchansk, of course, same sort of weapons are being used. Ukraine is on the offensive in here as well. It's the only area they are on active offensive, not reactive offensive. So reactive offensive may mean you're not planning for it, but if you have an opening, then you'll move forward. If that then makes sense. You can see Vovchansk has just been completely leveled. Now, while we're up in the north, we need to talk about a very interesting piece of land in Pishani in here. Now, of course, what I believe Russia's trying to do is push just directly west out of here. We'll try and expand on the way to not get cut off, but using then the Oskil River through here in a way that this works as a natural barrier, but it means it splits into a north and south group, and that logistics between Ukraine and these two areas is going to be then more difficult, especially with the hub of Kupiansk in here. That is my reading into this. Again, great to bounce ideas off a lot of people, which I'm very blessed to have, I should say. Now, let's have a look between then these two maps in here. So what the difference is primarily between these maps is showing that Russia has had more of a northern push here. Now, this is not being shown between the maps, but up in there, this direction here, there has been a direct north push, as well as it does show far more to the west that Russia has taken as well. Russian army began securing northern heights of Pishani. Meanwhile, troops continue advancing south between localities of Berestove and Novoselivsky. So, again, doesn't show this down in the South Sea right in here. It's showing between Berestove and Novoselivsky down on this front where my cursor is. So we'll see if these gets updated across other maps. Now, there is another change by the Russians today. So it's just down in here. It's Kremenar Forest, so just to the west of Dubrova. It is showing that Russians did make an advancement here in the direction of Torsky. Again, there's been a lot of talk about this Terny-Torsky front. We're not seeing too much changes very recently here as well. I think there's a lot of feeling out many different fronts and see where ground then could or could not be made. But we have one more area to talk about, and that is down in the Novomyalivka front towards Konstantinivka Mark II. This is something to be just aware of, is a lot of towns have the same name. Now, this is one of the areas where things start looking very different between what is red and what is grey. So just to get an idea, this is Konstantinivka, this is by this red dot here. This is, of course, the same reservoir, and it's showing that there has been ground made right up through the second, say, 2/3 of then this reservoir and down to the south too. So showing very different. The battle for Konstantinivka began after Russian army entered the first houses of the locality down here. So, of course, not confirmed over the maps, but still very interesting to look at and then speak about. Now, down at the Saki airfield in Crimea, it is a lot of reports that there has been ATACMS strikes as well. There's a lot of claims of things that have been hit yet. This is all the actual footage we have out yet. Again, like I say, everything in this war has a camera on it, from your GoPro to your drone to your front door ring camera. Wait for footage to come out before any of those confirmations are made. We see a lot of claims. I'm still waiting for the footage of the S500 that was claimed. Anyway, and the 40 bloody HIMARS that have been claimed as well, to give both sides one here. Now, the Ukrainian ambassador to Turkey, he has then another piece. He's talking about NATO. Of course, one of Ukraine's main primary goals is to join NATO. Although we know if we go through the negotiations that were done in Turkey at the beginning of this war, that Russia was okay in those negotiations from going through it. They were okay with Ukraine joining the EU, but then not NATO. And this is one of the reasons why Russia give for then entering into this war, or beginning this war in the beginning. Regarding objections to Kyiv's NATO membership, Ambassador Bodnar argued that if Washington administration decides to accept Ukraine's NATO membership, no one will object. Of course, NATO is the US. The US need NATO to have influence into Europe and then Eurasia into Asia. Otherwise, they're an isolated island, basically. But NATO need the US under the cover and safety of their nuclear umbrella and military umbrella as well. You get a lot of, and I think this annoys a lot of people, sometimes I get a bit like, you wouldn't be saying that if X, say, and Australia's a good example of this, but you'll get a small Baltic country sort of talking shit at China or Russia, and you're like, you wouldn't be saying this if you weren't under that umbrella of safety that the US and NATO then give to that area. Same as the US would not have the influence in Europe then across into Ukraine and then be able to exert power in other areas of the world if not for NATO and that alliance. It's very important both ways. Bodnar emphasised that the fact that the US and Germany have not taken a clear stance on Ukraine's NATO membership has given these countries manoeuvrability. So other countries are seeing where they actually sit on it because those two major powers there haven't given a clear idea. Again, I think these countries are waiting to see where the war ends. You can't say 100% they'll be in NATO before we have no idea where then this ends. There are also dissenting voices within NATO regarding Ukraine's membership. Earlier this year, Slovakian Prime Minister Robert Fico, who was shot, announced that Ukraine will not be accepted into NATO due to concerns that its admission would lead to World War III. Again, we have no idea how Russia or Ukraine will look after this war, what will be occupied, what will not be occupied. There's a lot of deals going through that are for 10 years, 100 years, whatever. Again, we have no idea how this will then end, but of course the majority of NATO countries are saying that Ukraine's future is within NATO. Again, I'll just say with everyone, take a step back before with what we see then in the future. I think Ukraine will eventually be within NATO in the EU. I do believe that, but again, we don't know until the fat lady sings. We know the war is over when we see Zelensky in a suit. That is one of the things I've seen. If he's in a suit, that's when real serious stuff is then happening. Now, the EU with frozen assets. This has been a big talking point from everyone, from people online through to bankers around the world. This links into the global south too. Ursula von der Leyen, of course, one of the heads of the EU, has said the EU sent to Ukraine. Today, we transfer 1.5 billion euros in proceeds from immobilized Russian assets to defense and reconstruction of Ukraine. So these are proceeds. So those Russian assets, depending on how you see it, many say they're stolen assets, many say they're frozen assets, and she's chosen the word immobilized here. Of course, this is not the asset. So say it's a $1 billion yacht. Let's just say that. Actually, no, that's a bad idea. Let's say it's $1 billion in cash sitting in the bank. They're not giving that $1 billion. They're giving the money of which that $1 billion makes then on top. So it might make 4% interest. Say they're giving then that 4% across. Now, for defence and reconstruction, I think a lot of these money given for reconstruction, yes, for energy grid, yes, for bits and pieces, but I've seen there was money given for reconstruction of a forest in the west of the country. And I'm like, try and focus on winning the war first, to be the piece on that, my 2 cents worth, and every arsehole has 2 cents. But this has caused quite a stir with these frozen Russian assets for quite some time, of many saying, does this undermine the euro, the pound, the dollar? Many around the world have said the major threat to the Western world is the reliance now on other economies. The dollar, the euro, pound has been so dominant for so long. Don't undermine this. Now, what we are seeing, say with China, or say with India, is a lot of these assets that have been frozen is just because they're Russian, not because a lot of them have anything to do with the war. Maybe some rich bloke who has a yacht, literally. So what people are saying is there's a lot of Chinese money, there's a lot of rich people with money in the West because of the security of the dollar, the pound, the euro. What people are pointing at, don't undermine this. That if you're a Chinese billionaire or you're a company CEO with a $1 trillion company in China, you know that your government may do something that the West may not like. Would you then let your money be secured in dollars, pounds, euros, knowing that if the Chinese government do something in Taiwan, your assets then may be frozen? That is what many people are saying, and they're saying the proceeds, just as much as the asset itself, could really change the tide on that. As we know, those economies, those developing economies around the world are becoming much, much more powerful, and we see a lot of countries stepping away from the use of the dollar, the pound, the euro towards maybe the yen or then something else. Saudi is a good example of this. So again, we will see how this then goes. I know a lot of bankers have been very critical of this. Now, speaking of the global south, we need to talk then about India and China, two of, I would say, the most important countries in this war outside of the US, Russia, and China. These are the countries that have a lot to benefit from relationships together with Russia, with America, with the EU. And again, I spoke about the other day, Kissinger said about the US that they have no permanent friends or enemies, only strategic interests. I believe these other superpowers, either economically, geopolitically, either way, they have strategic interest too. We can't discount these as countries of over 8 billion people that are coming to power incredibly quickly. But that China spoke with India today, and Zelensky's going to speak with India in the future. But India and Ukraine have recently had a bit of then a falling out. Now, this was on then the 16th, after we saw the Russian missiles go into Kyiv, that, this might be too early, on the 9th of July, Zelensky has said when he saw a photograph of the Prime Minister Modi of India hugging then Putin, he said, "It is a huge disappointment and a devastating blow to peace efforts to see the leader of the world's largest democracy hug the world's most bloody criminal in Moscow on such a day." And everyone said has blasted the Indian Prime Minister. Now, India has then summoned the Ukrainian envoy with New Delhi's displeasure with Ukrainian disposition on the issue of Zelensky's comments against the PM, then just on a week later. And then it said that India had postponed a meeting of the joint working group on culture with Ukraine in the backdrop of the incident. Now, I talked with a few people who specifically in politics, and their biggest critique, I'm trying to get one on the podcast, but yeah, their biggest critique of Ukraine is using guilt in politics more than pros and cons, and don't try and guilt people into then a corner. Now, this has then swung around just 9 days later that Indian PM Modi to visit Ukraine in August. So the first one cancelled now. He will visit in August, but still in the planning will occur the third week of August, likely sometime around Ukraine's Independence Day. Earlier this year, Volodymyr Zelensky extended an invitation to Modi during a phone conversation. India is incredibly important in this war, of course. The Ukraine peace summit thing in Switzerland did not manage to get India, of course, over here, to sign then their communique. Of course, the countries that did attend but didn't sign then are in the pinky purple here as well. India is a powerhouse. It will be very interesting to see how the situation on the ground is at late August, and that will, of course, affect how the Indian Prime Minister will have these conversations with Ukraine. Now, China and India. This was only from today that Wang Yi, who of course met with Dmitry Kuleba, who is Ukraine's foreign minister, earlier than this week, has met with the Indian foreign minister as well, the Indian external affairs minister. I'm not going to try and pronounce it, I'm sorry. But Wang Yi said the important impact of China-India relations goes beyond bilateral scope. Improving bilateral relations should reflect the strategic vision of China and India as two major emerging developing countries. Call back to when I talked about strategic interests over friends and enemies. He emphasised that China-India relationship, back on the right track, serves the interests of both sides and meets the shared aspiration of countries of the global south. Increase of influence there. These are two countries with the largest populations, two major emerging economies, and ancient civilizations with long histories. The two sides indicated their readiness to strengthen communication within the framework of East Asia cooperation with the SCO, G20 and BRICS. Things we've all spoken about, I think, last video, the video before, especially with the SCO, BRICS as well, and the importance of that emerging too, and jointly practice multilateralism and uphold the legitimate rights and interests of developing countries. A lot of impact, and just look where China and India are in the global south. Dead center, massive economies, can benefit from, of course, the rise of the global south, more so than really anyone else, of course. India with a growing population as well. So then let's talk about then China. We spoke a bit about China then. We're going to speak more on it. China is an incredibly important ally of Russia, but incredibly important to try and maybe have some influence on Russia too. Many say that we're overestimating the amount of diplomatic pull that China can actually have on Russia and how much they're willing then to actually sanction Russia themselves. And how realistic is this? How realistic is it to have a country that has every resource in the world, Russia next to the country that makes basically everything in the world, to actually have effective sanctions then between the two from the West outside looking in? Of course, there's mutual benefit for those two countries doing it. But this was from the European Union External Action today. Now, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to my knowledge, when I tried to find, didn't make their own statement on this. But the High Representative, Joseph Borrell, of course, of the EU, met with Foreign Minister Wang Yi. He's been a busy guy. I hope he's paid hourly. So, first of all, China support Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, which impacts negatively in EU-China relations. That's what Borrell was saying. That this explained why the European Union considers Russia's war against Ukraine as an existential threat to Europe. He expressed his concern because China's export of large amounts of dual-use goods and items represents a support to Russia to build up its military equipment. Again, dual-use items can be basically anything. I just don't know how. There's no way anyone's ever going to send Western or allow Western inspectors on the border between Russia and China, or Kazakhstan and China and Russia, anywhere there, to inspect freight train going across. And like I've said, the export of dual-use items can be anything from, you could say a phone is a dual-use item, to a drone, to a bomb. Bomb's single-use, but still, you understand what then I mean. How can you really do that? I don't see it being realistically effective to then prevent this en masse. And not only, China may say we may not, give Russia weapons, but will Russia just buy weapons off China as well, like we have then seen happen, not for things like tanks or aircraft, but we may see that in the future. Everyone looks at Russia's industrial capacity. Is it meeting the replacement of things like tanks and this and that? And many will say no, some will say it's right on par, either way. But could Russia turn around and go, well, instead of making them, we're just going to buy them off China, or buy back old ones that China bought off us in the past? China's got a lot of old in the Soviet stuff, or more recent Russian stuff in the form of planes. Could that be an option there? He asked China to use its influence on Russia to contribute to the end of the war. He asked China to support the Ukraine peace process, of course, Zelensky's 10-point peace plan, and considered that the joint statement of Brazil of May 24 does not go in that direction. So that he's asking China to support Zelensky's peace plan, not what China and Brazil said in May 24. I think good luck with that, with how the situation has changed since then. Now, if you don't know what we're on about, this was, of course, two BRICS countries, two major populations and economies, China and Brazil. This was what they came to in May 24. You can find all this on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China website. That number one is two sides call the relevant parties to observe three principles of de-escalating: no expansion of the battlefield, no escalation of fighting, and no provocation. Believe that dialogue and negotiation are the only viable solution to the Ukraine crisis. Increase humanitarian assistance, of course, swap back of people in occupied areas and POWs too. No use of WMDs, no attacks on nuclear power plants, and dividing the world into isolated political and economic groups should be opposed. So then lifting sanctions, you don't have this area and that area. You don't have the global south or Russia isolated, or the EU or NATO. I know NATO is not an economic alliance, but still that isolation there either. And to promote peace talks in this, people talk about there's no talking about sovereignty of land, 91 borders of this here. Now, so it's Borrell asking that it doesn't go in this direction. The second EU concern, the EU relations with China, is the impact of economic policies and production subsidies, which cause distortions on the EU's market. China should also address the root causes of our unbalanced trade relationship by rebalancing its economy. Again, I think good luck with asking China to rebalance its economy because of distortion on the EU's market. China, of this conflict, conflicts around the world that divide countries in the West, that disarm countries, even Russia or America or NATO countries sending stuff into Ukraine, whether it's Russia as well sending stuff in, I see that China is the country to benefit then the most out of this. They gain experience through seeing how the war plays out and seeing how traditional warfare then looks. It's not losing any of its weapon systems. It's not spending any of its government money in this to a large degree. I think they're the ones to benefit the most from that, as well as they're getting seen by many countries around the world as the middle ground, reasonable voice in a lot of this. And people, I'm not saying that that China is this, but many people around the world are seeing that they are a voice of reason for Israel, Gaza, Ukraine, Russia, and building ties very, very close, and more countries swinging into economic, financial influence of China. Like I've said, I think this century could belong to the global south. We're only in 2024. See how quickly things can change in 80 odd years. China's got a vast hybrid war happening very obviously in your face with seeing Belt and Road stuff, and not as clearly behind the scenes as well in many different areas around the world. Anyway, legends, I hope you have a fantastic day. This was not meant to go this long. Look after yourselves, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.